The autumn wind carried the scent of approaching winter through the streets of Washer, rattling the windows of the county courthouse, where families gathered with the desperate hope of people who had run out of options. Inside the stark courtroom, children sat in wooden chairs that were too large for their small frames, their eyes holding the particular emptiness that came from losing everything that had once felt permanent. The orphan court convened twice yearly to address the growing problem of parentless children in a territory where death came too easily and too often, leaving behind young souls who needed more than charity could provide. Judge Harrison Caldwell surveyed the crowded room with the weary expression of a man who had presided over too many similar proceedings, each one a reminder that frontier life extracted costs that could not always be calculated in dollars and acres. Before him sat 23 children ranging in age from 4 to 15, survivors of consumption, farming accidents, harsh winters, and the dozens of other calamities that had made orphans as common as abandoned homesteads throughout the Colorado Territory. The judge's responsibility was to find practical solutions for their care, which usually meant binding them out to families who needed additional labor in exchange for food, shelter, and basic education. It was not an ideal system, but it was the only system available in a place where formal orphanages remained dreams rather than realities, where communities struggled to care for their own children without taking on the additional burden of those who belonged to no one. Most of the adults present had come seeking older boys who could help with spring planting or girls old enough to assist with household duties and younger children. Few were prepared to take on the expense and responsibility of children too young for useful work, which meant that the smallest orphans often remained in temporary care until they grew large enough to earn their keep. The morning proceedings had followed their predictable pattern, with farming families selecting children based on immediate needs rather than sentimental considerations. The Hendersons had chosen 12-year-old Peter Novak, whose parents had died in a barn fire, because their own son had been kicked by a horse and would never again manage heavy farm work. The Williamses had taken 14-year-old Mary Catherine O'Brien, recently orphaned by consumption, because their aging mother needed assistance with cooking and household management. One by one, the older children found placements that offered survival in exchange for labor, arrangements that were honest, if not particularly warm. But 7 children remained unclaimed when Judge Caldwell called the afternoon session to order. 7 small faces that represented the human cost of a system designed around economic necessity rather than childhood welfare. Tommy Nelson, age 6, whose parents had frozen to death during last winter's blizzards. The Chen twins, Li and Mei, age 4, whose parents had died in a mining accident that had also destroyed their small savings. Sarah and Rebecca Maples, ages 5 and 7, whose mother had died in childbirth and whose father had disappeared shortly afterward, leaving them with neighbors who could no longer afford to feed extra mouths. And little Danny Cruz, barely 3 years old, who had been found wandering alone after his parents' wagon was attacked by bandits on the Territorial Road. These were the children that charity could not easily place, too young to work, too expensive to maintain, requiring years of investment before they could contribute to household economies. Judge Caldwell had been preparing to adjourn the session and arrange temporary placement with the County Poor Farm, a solution that satisfied legal requirements while condemning the children to institutional care that rarely produced happy outcomes, when the courtroom doors opened with a sound that drew every eye toward the back of the room. The woman who entered moved with a kind of quiet confidence that suggested she was accustomed to drawing attention without seeking it, her presence somehow both commanding and understated. She appeared to be in her middle 30s, though her face carried a maturity that spoke of experiences beyond her years. Her clothing was well-made but practical, a dark blue traveling dress with clean lines and quality fabric, a matching coat that had been tailored to fit perfectly, leather gloves that showed no signs of hard use. Everything about her appearance suggested substantial means without ostentation, the kind of wealth that came from good judgment rather than inheritance. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, dark and intelligent, holding depths that seemed to take in every detail of the courtroom scene while revealing nothing about her own thoughts or intentions. She walked to the front of the room with measured steps, her gaze moving from child to child with an intensity that made the adults present shift uncomfortably in their seats. There was something almost predatory in her assessment, though whether she represented threat or salvation remained unclear to the watching crowd. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying the cultured accent of Eastern education mixed with the practical directness of someone accustomed to frontier realities, "I understand that several children remain without placement today." Judge Caldwell studied her with the careful attention he brought to all unexpected courtroom developments, noting the quality of her clothing, the confidence of her bearing, the way she seemed to command space without making any obvious effort to do so. "That's correct, ma'am. Might I ask your interest in the matter?" "I wish to assume responsibility for the 7 remaining children," she replied without hesitation, her words falling into the courtroom silence like stones into deep water. "All of them." The murmur that rose from the assembled crowd carried undertones of shock, suspicion, and the particular unease that came from witnessing something that challenged normal expectations. Single women did not typically seek to adopt multiple orphan children, particularly not women who appeared to possess the means to live comfortably without taking on such enormous responsibilities. Judge Caldwell leaned forward in his chair, his expression mixing curiosity with professional caution. "Ma'am, I appreciate your generous intentions, but perhaps you don't fully understand the commitment involved in caring for 7 children, particularly children so young. The youngest is barely 3 years old, and several of them will require years of support before they can contribute to household management." The woman smiled for the first time since entering the courtroom, an expression that transformed her severe features into something almost beautiful, though it carried depths that seemed to hold secrets the watching crowd could not begin to guess. "Your Honor, I understand the commitment perfectly. I have given this matter considerable thought, and I am prepared to provide not only basic care, but education, proper clothing, medical attention, and everything else these children will need to build successful lives." She reached into her coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, from which she extracted several documents that rustled crisply in the afternoon air. "I have prepared the necessary financial guarantees, along with references that should address any concerns about my ability to provide appropriate care." Judge Caldwell accepted the papers with the careful attention he brought to all legal documents, though his eyebrows rose as he examined the contents. The financial statements showed bank accounts in Denver and Chicago that contained more money than most Washer residents would see in their lifetimes. The references came from Territorial officials, business leaders, and Eastern attorneys, whose names carried weight even in frontier courtrooms. But perhaps most surprising was the final document, a deed to a substantial property outside Washer that had been purchased just 3 days earlier. "Miss," Judge Caldwell paused, realizing he had not yet learned her name. "Mrs. Catherine Worthington," she supplied, though something in the way she spoke suggested the name might not tell the complete story of who she was or where she had come from. "Mrs. Worthington, these documents appear to be in order, but I must ask about your motivations. It's unusual for someone to seek custody of so many children without some personal connection to their circumstances." Catherine Worthington's expression shifted slightly, revealing glimpses of emotions too complex to be easily categorized. When she spoke, her voice carried undertones of experience that had been hard-won through circumstances the courtroom audience could only imagine. "Your Honor, every child deserves the chance to grow up knowing they are wanted, knowing they matter to someone who will fight for their welfare and their future. These children have lost everything through no fault of their own. If I can provide them with security, education, and the kind of family they deserve, then that seems like the most worthwhile use of whatever resources I possess." It was a beautiful sentiment, spoken with apparent sincerity, but something in her tone suggested that her motivations went deeper than simple charitable impulse. Judge Caldwell studied her face, searching for clues about the real reasons behind her unprecedented offer, but her expression revealed only determined kindness and the kind of resolve that suggested she would not be easily dissuaded from her purpose. "Mrs. Worthington, while I appreciate your generous offer, I have a responsibility to ensure that these children are placed in appropriate situations. Perhaps you could start with 1 or 2 children, demonstrate your ability to provide proper care, and then consider expanding your household if circumstances prove favorable. The suggestion was reasonable and practical, the kind of cautious approach that protected everyone involved from consequences that might prove difficult to reverse. But Catherine Worthington shook her head with gentle firmness, her dark eyes moving again to the 7 small faces that watched the adult conversation with the particular anxiety of children whose futures were being decided by strangers. Your Honor, families are not built through careful experimentation. These children have already experienced enough uncertainty and separation. If I am to provide them with real security, it must be complete security, all of them together, starting today. She paused, allowing her gaze to rest on each child individually. Tommy Nelson with his shock of red hair and freckled face, the Chen twins holding hands with the fierce determination of children who had learned that they could depend only on each other. Sarah and Rebecca Maples, whose resemblance to their lost mother was heartbreaking in its clarity. Little Danny Cruz, whose thumb had found its way to his mouth as he watched the incomprehensible adult proceedings that would determine where he spent his childhood. These children have lost their parents, their homes, their sense of belonging to anyone or anywhere. What they need is not another temporary arrangement or trial placement. What they need is to belong to a family that chooses them completely and permanently, that commits to their welfare without reservation or conditions. Judge Caldwell found himself moved by her words despite his professional caution, though questions remained about her background, her motivations, and her ability to manage the enormous practical challenges involved in raising 7 orphan children. The financial documents proved she possessed adequate resources, but money alone did not guarantee successful child-rearing, particularly with children who had already experienced significant trauma and loss. Mrs. Worthington, if I approve this arrangement, what assurances can you provide regarding the children's education, religious instruction, and preparation for adult responsibilities? I intend to hire qualified tutors to ensure each child receives education appropriate to their abilities and interests. Religious instruction will be provided according to their family traditions, or according to their own choices as they mature. As for adult responsibilities, they will learn practical skills through participation in household management, but they will also be encouraged to pursue whatever careers or callings match their talents and inclinations. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had already considered every aspect of the commitment she was proposing, but there was something in her tone that suggested personal experience with the challenges of childhood displacement and the importance of educational opportunities in determining adult possibilities. The courtroom remained silent except for the whispered conversations of adults who were trying to make sense of a development that challenged their understanding of normal human motivations. Wealthy women did not typically decide to adopt multiple orphan children on impulse, particularly not children who would require years of expensive care before they could contribute anything to household economies. There had to be more to Catherine Worthington's story than simple charitable impulses, though what that might be remained a mystery that would likely persist long after the afternoon's proceedings concluded. Your Honor, Catherine continued, I understand your caution, and I respect your responsibility to protect these children's welfare. But I would ask you to consider their alternatives. The County Poor Farm is not equipped to provide individual attention or educational opportunities. Separating them into different households would mean they lose not only their original families, but also each other. What I'm proposing gives them the chance to remain together while receiving everything they need to build successful adult lives. Judge Caldwell looked again at the 7 children whose futures hung in the balance, noting how the older ones had moved protectively closer to the younger ones, how they seemed to understand that staying together was not guaranteed, how their eyes held the wariness of children who had learned not to expect too much from adult promises. The practical difficulties of Catherine Worthington's proposal were significant, but the alternatives were genuinely troubling for children so young and so clearly traumatized by their recent losses. Mrs. Worthington, assuming I approve this arrangement, what specific provisions will you make for the children's immediate care? Where will they live? Who will supervise their daily activities? What happens if circumstances change and you find yourself unable to continue providing adequate care? Catherine reached into her portfolio again and withdrew a detailed written plan that demonstrated considerable forethought about the practical challenges she would face. I have purchased the Maples property outside town, a substantial house with enough bedrooms to provide appropriate accommodations for all 7 children. I have already hired Mrs. Hannah Sanford as housekeeper and child supervisor, and Dr. Margaret Fleming has agreed to serve as the children's physician. If something happens to me, provisions have been made through my attorney to ensure the children's continued care and education through a trust fund that will support them until they reach adulthood. The thoroughness of her preparations impressed even Judge Caldwell, though it also raised additional questions about how long she had been planning this action and what had motivated her to make such extensive commitments to children she had never met. No one made such elaborate arrangements on sudden impulse, which meant Catherine Worthington had been considering this decision for weeks or possibly months before appearing in his courtroom. Mrs. Worthington, I must ask directly, do you have any personal connection to these children or their families? Any particular reason for choosing this specific group rather than orphaned children in other counties or territories? For the first time since entering the courtroom, Catherine hesitated, her composed expression flickering with emotions that suggested her motivations were indeed more complex than simple charitable impulse. When she spoke, her voice carried undertones of pain that had been carefully controlled but not entirely eliminated. Your Honor, I do not have any direct connection to these particular children, but I understand something about what it means to lose family, to feel unwanted, to grow up believing that love is something other people deserve, but not something that will ever be offered freely to you. If I can spare these children that experience, if I can give them the kind of security and affection that every child should have, then that seems like the most important work I could possibly do with my life. The courtroom fell silent as her words settled over the assembled crowd, revealing glimpses of personal history that explained both her unusual offer and the depth of emotion that drove her commitment to these orphan children. Judge Caldwell studied her face, seeing past her composed exterior to the woman who understood childhood abandonment from personal experience, who had somehow transformed her own losses into motivation to prevent other children from experiencing similar pain. Mrs. Worthington, I appreciate your honesty, and I'm moved by your commitment to these children's welfare. However, I must also consider the concerns that other community members might have about this arrangement. Single women adopting multiple children is unusual enough to generate considerable speculation and possible criticism. Are you prepared for that kind of attention? Catherine's smile returned, though this time it carried a steely quality that suggested she was quite capable of handling whatever criticism her choices might generate. Your Honor, people will always find reasons to criticize actions they don't understand or approve of. What matters is not their opinions, but these children's welfare. I'm prepared to provide excellent care regardless of what other people choose to think about my motivations or methods. Judge Caldwell nodded slowly, recognizing both the strength of her conviction and the potential for community controversy that might complicate the children's adjustment to their new circumstances. Washer was a small town where unusual behavior generated extensive discussion, and Catherine Worthington's unprecedented adoption would certainly provide material for months of speculation and debate. Very well, Mrs. Worthington. Based on your financial guarantees, your prepared arrangements, and your evident commitment to these children's welfare, I'm prepared to approve temporary custody pending a 6-month evaluation period. If the arrangement proves successful for both you and the children, we can discuss permanent adoption at that time. Catherine nodded her acceptance of these terms, though something in her expression suggested she viewed the arrangement as permanent regardless of what legal documents might specify. She had made commitments that went beyond temporary custody, and the watching crowd sensed that she would not easily be separated from children she had chosen to claim as her own. Children, Judge Caldwell addressed the 7 small figures who had listened to the adult conversation with the grave attention of those whose lives were being irrevocably changed. Mrs. Worthington has offered to provide you with a home, education, and family. Do any of you have questions or concerns about this arrangement? Tommy Nelson, the oldest at 6 years, raised his hand with the careful politeness of a child who had learned that adult attention could be either blessing or curse. "Sir, will we all stay together?" "All 7 of us." "Yes," Catherine answered before Judge Caldwell could respond, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "All 7 of you, together, for as long as you want to be part of the same family." The Chen twins exchanged glances that seemed to communicate volumes about their shared experiences and mutual dependence, while Sarah and Rebecca Maples moved closer together with the instinctive protectiveness of sisters who had already lost too much. Little Danny Cruz took his thumb out of his mouth long enough to ask the question that mattered most to his 3-year-old understanding. "Will you be our mama now?" Catherine knelt to his eye level, her composed exterior cracking slightly to reveal the genuine emotion that drove her unprecedented offer. "If you want me to be, Danny, if you all want me to be your family, then that's exactly what we'll be." The children's acceptance was given with the swift decisiveness of those who had learned to recognize genuine offers of security when they appeared. And within an hour, Catherine Worthington had become the legal guardian of 7 orphaned children whose lives had been transformed by a woman whose motivations remained mysterious, but whose commitment seemed unshakable. As the courtroom emptied and the new family prepared to leave together, the adults of Washer began the whispered conversations that would continue for months, trying to understand why a wealthy woman would choose to burden herself with 7 orphaned children, what her real motivations might be, and whether her unprecedented generosity represented genuine charity or something more complex and potentially troubling. But the children themselves seemed unconcerned with adult speculations about their benefactor's motivations. They had found someone willing to claim them completely, someone who promised security and education and the kind of belonging they had thought lost forever when death claimed their original families. Whatever questions remained about Catherine Worthington's background and motivations would be answered in time, but for now, it was enough that 7 orphaned children would sleep that night knowing they belonged somewhere, knowing someone had chosen them not for what they could provide, but simply because they needed love and family. The Maples property, where Catherine Worthington had planned to raise her newly acquired family, sat on a gentle rise overlooking the Washer Valley, a substantial 2-story house built by ambitious homesteaders who had dreamed of prosperity that never quite materialized. The previous owners had been forced to sell when drought destroyed 3 consecutive crops, leaving behind a well-built home with spacious rooms, solid construction, and the kind of practical design that frontier families required for successful child-rearing. Catherine had purchased the property along with its furniture and farm equipment, creating an instant household capable of supporting her unprecedented family expansion. The evening of the adoption, 7 children found themselves standing in the front parlor of a house that seemed impossibly large after months of temporary accommodations in crowded households where they had been tolerated rather than welcomed. Catherine moved among them with quiet efficiency, assigning bedrooms, explaining household routines, and beginning the complex process of transforming a collection of orphaned individuals into something resembling a functioning family unit. The first month of Catherine Worthington's unprecedented family arrangement passed with a kind of careful routine that suggested she understood something about healing traumatized children that went beyond simple good intentions. Each morning began with breakfast around the large kitchen table, where 7 small voices gradually learned to participate in conversations that included them rather than merely discuss their futures. She had hired Mrs. Hannah Sanford, a widow with grown children of her own, whose patient competence with daily household management freed Catherine to focus on the more complex challenges of helping each child adjust to their new circumstances. Tommy Nelson, at 6 the acknowledged leader among the children, appointed himself protector of the younger ones with the fierce determination of someone who had learned too early that adults could not always be trusted to keep their promises. He watched Catherine constantly during those first weeks, searching for signs that her commitment might prove temporary, that circumstances might change and force another abandonment that would scatter his makeshift family to different households throughout the territory. His wariness was understandable given his recent losses, but it also revealed an intelligence and emotional maturity that Catherine recognized as both blessing and burden for someone so young. The Chen twins, Li and Mei, communicated primarily with each other in rapid exchanges of Cantonese mixed with English, their shared language creating a private world that helped them maintain connection to parents whose mining camp had been their entire universe before the cave-in that claimed their lives. Catherine made no attempt to discourage their native language, instead hiring Mr. James Chun from the railroad construction camp to visit twice weekly and ensure the twins maintained fluency in both tongues. This decision surprised the Washer community, where immigrant children were typically expected to abandon their heritage as quickly as possible. But Catherine seemed determined that her adopted children should honor their origins rather than erase them. Sarah and Rebecca Maples had withdrawn into themselves following their mother's death and their father's mysterious disappearance, communicating through glances and gestures that required no words. Rebecca, the elder at 7, had assumed responsibility for 5-year-old Sarah with the grim efficiency of someone who understood that survival might depend on mutual protection. Catherine watched their careful choreography of shared dependence and made no immediate attempt to separate them, recognizing that their bond represented security in a world that had proven unreliable and potentially dangerous. Little Danny Cruz presented different challenges, his 3-year-old understanding of recent events creating confusion about why his parents had disappeared and whether Catherine might vanish, as well if he failed to meet some unknown standard of behavior. He followed her through the house with the desperate persistence of someone too young to understand permanence, requiring constant reassurance that she would return from trips to town, that bedtime did not mean morning abandonment, that his new family would not dissolve while he slept. Catherine approached each child's individual needs with a kind of informed patience that suggested she understood trauma from personal experience, though she revealed nothing about her own background that might explain such knowledge. She maintained consistent routines that provided predictability, established clear expectations that gave the children structure without feeling punitive, and created opportunities for choice and independence that allowed them to rebuild confidence in their own judgment and capabilities. The community of Washer watched these developments with the fascinated attention that small towns brought to any deviation from expected behavior, particularly when that deviation involved someone whose background remained largely mysterious. Catherine Worthington had appeared among them with substantial financial resources and obvious education, but she revealed nothing about her previous life that might explain her current choices. She attended church services regularly with all 7 children, participated in community events that required her presence, and conducted business in town with polite efficiency. But she shared no personal history that might satisfy the curiosity her unprecedented adoption had generated. Mrs. Elizabeth Hawthorne, the banker's wife and unofficial arbiter of Washer's social standards, made several attempts to extract information about Catherine's background through the kind of determined questioning that frontier communities use to establish newcomers' credentials and assess their suitability for inclusion in local society. These efforts met with polite deflection and gracious refusal to provide details that Catherine apparently considered private rather than public information. She's educated, that's certain. Mrs. Hawthorne informed her regular circle of ladies who gathered weekly for quilting and comprehensive discussion of community affairs. Her speech shows Eastern schooling, and she knows literature well enough to quote Shakespeare without consulting books. But she won't say where she was educated or who her people might be. Claims to be widowed, but offers no details about her late husband or his family connections. The absence of verifiable background information created fertile ground for speculation that ranged from reasonable possibilities to elaborate theories that said more about their creators' imaginations than about Catherine's actual history. Some suggested she was the daughter of a wealthy Eastern family who had experienced some scandal requiring relocation to frontier anonymity. Others proposed that she might be the widow of a successful businessman whose estate provided her current financial independence. A few whispered darker possibilities involving criminal activity or family disgrace that necessitated complete separation from previous associations. But the children themselves seemed unconcerned with their guardian's mysterious past, focusing instead on the daily reality of adequate food, clean clothing, educational opportunities, and the kind of consistent adult attention they had lost when death claimed their original families. Catherine proved to be a demanding but fair teacher, establishing a schoolroom in the house's former parlor, where she provided instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history that exceeded what most frontier children received from overworked territorial schools. Her teaching methods revealed additional clues about her background, suggesting formal training in education along with personal experience that made her particularly effective with children who had experienced significant trauma. She understood when to push for progress and when to allow time for emotional recovery, when to maintain high expectations, and when to offer comfort for failures that might trigger memories of previous losses. Most importantly, she seemed to recognize that healing required both challenge and security, both individual attention and group belonging. The children's progress during their first month together impressed even Catherine's critics in the washer community, though it also raised additional questions about her motivations and long-term plans. Tommy Nelson lost some of his defensive wariness and began participating in lessons with genuine enthusiasm rather than mere compliance. The Chen twins started incorporating English into their private conversations, suggesting they felt secure enough to risk broader communication. Sarah and Rebecca Maples began speaking to adults other than each other, tentative steps toward trusting that the world might contain people who meant them no harm. Most remarkably, little Danny Cruz stopped following Catherine through the house with desperate persistence, gradually accepting that she would return from trips to town and that bedtime did not threaten morning abandonment. His increasing confidence in the permanence of his new family situation allowed him to begin behaving like a normal 3-year-old rather than a traumatized refugee from circumstances beyond his understanding. These positive developments satisfied Judge Caldwell's requirements for the initial evaluation period, but they also attracted attention from unexpected sources that would soon complicate Catherine's carefully constructed new life in Washer. Word of her unprecedented adoption had spread beyond the immediate community through the kind of informal networks that connected frontier settlements, reaching people whose interest in her activities went far beyond simple curiosity about unusual charitable impulses. The first indication of trouble arrived on a cold November morning when Catherine found a well-dressed stranger waiting on her front porch, his expensive clothing and confident bearing marking him as someone unaccustomed to being kept waiting or having his request denied. He introduced himself as Mr. Marcus Whitfield, representing what he described as interested parties, who had questions about her recent activities and her long-term plans for the children she had adopted. Mrs. Worthington, he began with a kind of practiced courtesy that barely concealed underlying threat. I understand you've recently assumed responsibility for several orphan children. My clients have concerns about the welfare of these children and whether their current arrangements serve their best interests. Catherine studied him with the careful attention she had learned to bring to unexpected visitors, noting the quality of his boots, the gold watch chain visible beneath his coat, the soft hands that had never known physical labor. Everything about his appearance suggested substantial financial backing and the kind of professional experience that made him dangerous to anyone whose activities attracted unwelcome scrutiny. Mr. Whitfield, I'm not sure what concerns your clients might have about children who are receiving excellent care in a stable family environment. Perhaps you could clarify what specific issues have prompted your visit. Whitfield's smile carried no warmth, only the calculated threat of someone accustomed to achieving his objectives through carefully applied pressure. Mrs. Worthington, my clients represent various interests throughout the Colorado Territory, including several families who believe they might provide more appropriate homes for these particular children. They're prepared to make generous offers that would compensate you for any expenses you've incurred while ensuring the children receive care that's better suited to their backgrounds and future prospects. The suggestion that anyone might forcibly purchase the children she had legally adopted sent cold fear through Catherine's chest, though she maintained her composed exterior while rapidly calculating the implications of Whitfield's visit. Someone with substantial resources and political connections had identified her small family as a target for reasons that remained unclear but were certainly unwelcome. Mr. Whitfield, these children are not for sale. They are my legally adopted family, and any attempt to remove them from my care would require court proceedings that I would contest vigorously. I suggest you inform your clients that their offers are neither necessary nor welcome. Whitfield's expression shifted slightly, revealing glimpses of the harder man beneath his veneer of professional courtesy. Mrs. Worthington, I think you may not fully understand the situation. My clients have considerable influence with territorial authorities, and they're prepared to use that influence to ensure these children receive what they consider appropriate care. Cooperation would be much easier for everyone involved than the alternatives we might be forced to pursue. The threat was clear enough, though Catherine suspected there were layers to this situation that Whitfield had not yet revealed. No one made such elaborate efforts to acquire orphan children without specific motivations that went beyond simple charitable concern for their welfare. Someone wanted these particular children for reasons that had nothing to do with providing them better homes, which meant Catherine's family faced dangers she was only beginning to understand. Mr. Whitfield, I appreciate your visit, but I must ask you to leave my property. Any future communications regarding the children should be directed through my attorney rather than through these informal consultations. Whitfield studied her face with a calculating attention of someone trying to assess potential resistance to his client's objectives, clearly surprised by her refusal to consider negotiations that he had obviously expected would prove persuasive. When he spoke again, his voice carried undertones of warning that suggested his clients were not accustomed to having their wishes denied. Mrs. Worthington, I hope you'll reconsider this decision. My clients are patient, but their patience is not unlimited. These children represent opportunities that extend beyond your current understanding, and those opportunities will be pursued regardless of your personal preferences. After he left, Catherine stood at her front window, watching his expensive carriage disappear down the road toward town while trying to understand what forces she had inadvertently challenged by adopting 7 orphan children. The implied threats were serious enough to require immediate attention, but they also raised questions about why anyone would go to such lengths to acquire children whose only obvious value lay in their need for family and security. That evening, after the children had been settled in their bedrooms with a kind of consistent routine that helped them feel secure in their new circumstances, Catherine sat in her study examining documents that might provide clues about the mysterious interest in her adopted family. The children's original records contained nothing unusual. Standard documentation of parental deaths, brief descriptions of their circumstances, routine assessments of their health and temperament. But as she reviewed each file more carefully, patterns began to emerge that suggested her family might represent more than simple charitable opportunity. Tommy Nelson's parents had owned a small ranch that bordered land currently being surveyed for railroad development. The Chen twins' parents had been working mining claims that might prove valuable if recent geological surveys proved accurate. Sarah and Rebecca Maples' disappeared father had been a surveyor whose notes and maps might contain information about territorial resources that various interests would find profitable. Even little Danny Cruz's family had been traveling with a wagon train that included territorial officials whose business might have involved information or resources that could prove valuable to the right buyers. The realization that her children might be targets not because of who they were, but because of what their parents had known or owned sent additional fear through Catherine's understanding of their situation. If Whitfield's clients were seeking to acquire children whose inheritance rights or family knowledge might prove financially valuable, then her family faced threats that went far beyond simple custody disputes. The next morning brought news that confirmed her worst fears about the forces arrayed against her small family. Mrs. Sanford arrived pale and shaken from a conversation with her sister in town, who had overheard discussions at the bank about territorial officials asking questions regarding Catherine's financial arrangements and her legal standing to adopt multiple children without territorial approval. Mrs. Worthington, the older woman, said quietly while the children ate breakfast in the kitchen, unaware that their security was being threatened by people whose names they would never know. There's talk that some folks want to challenge your adoption, claim you don't have proper authority to take on so many children at once. They're saying it ain't natural for a woman alone to want so many responsibilities, suggesting there might be something wrong with your motivations. Catherine absorbed this information with a kind of calm that came from years of experience dealing with people who confused legal authority with moral right, though she understood that challenges to her custody would be far more serious than simple community gossip. If territorial officials could be persuaded to question her adoption, the children might be removed from her care and redistributed to families whose primary qualifications lay in their willingness to pay for the privilege of acquiring potential heirs to valuable properties or information. Mrs. Sanford, I want you to take the children to your sister's house in town this afternoon. Tell them it's a special visit, but keep them there until I come for them. Don't let them out of your sight, and don't allow anyone else to take responsibility for their care, no matter what authority they might claim to possess. The older woman nodded grimly, understanding that the situation had escalated beyond simple community disapproval into something that threatened the children's safety and security. What are you planning to do? Catherine's expression hardened with a kind of resolve that suggested she possessed resources and experience that went far beyond what she had revealed to her washer neighbors. I'm going to find out exactly who wants my children and why, and then I'm going to make sure they understand that some things cannot be purchased at any price. The afternoon brought additional visitors, whose presence confirmed Catherine's growing understanding that her family had become the target of a coordinated effort by people with substantial resources and political connections. Judge Caldwell arrived with obvious reluctance, accompanied by two territorial officials whose expensive clothing and confident bearing marked them as men accustomed to having their authority respected without question. Mrs. Worthington, Judge Caldwell began with the uncomfortable tone of someone forced to pursue actions against his better judgment. I've received complaints about your adoption arrangements that require official investigation. These gentlemen represent territorial child welfare authorities, and they have questions about your qualifications to care for so many children simultaneously. Catherine invited them into her parlor with a kind of gracious politeness that concealed her growing anger at the forces arrayed against her family, noting how the territorial officials examined her furnishings and personal belongings with the calculating attention of people assessing assets rather than evaluating child care capabilities. Gentlemen, I'm happy to address any concerns about the children's welfare. As you can see, they're receiving excellent care in a stable home environment with educational opportunities that exceed what most frontier children enjoy. The senior territorial official, who had introduced himself as Commissioner Franklin Hayes, studied her with a kind of professional skepticism that suggested he had already reached conclusions about her suitability before beginning his investigation. Mrs. Worthington, while we appreciate your charitable intentions, the territorial government has responsibility for ensuring that orphan children receive appropriate care. 7 children represent a significant responsibility that might be better distributed among multiple families throughout the territory. The suggestion that her family should be broken apart and scattered to different households confirmed Catherine's suspicions about the real motivations driving this investigation. Commissioner Hayes was not concerned about the children's welfare. He was implementing a plan designed to separate them so they could be more easily controlled by whoever had initiated this coordinated assault on her family. Commissioner Hayes, these children have already experienced enough separation and trauma. They're thriving together in a secure family environment, and any attempt to remove them from my care would constitute additional trauma that serves no constructive purpose. Hayes exchanged glances with his companion that suggested they had anticipated resistance and prepared responses designed to overcome any objections she might raise. Mrs. Worthington, the territorial government has received information suggesting that your motivations for adopting these particular children may not be entirely charitable. There are questions about your background and your long-term plans that require clarification before we can approve permanent custody arrangements. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, creating atmosphere that made honest conversation impossible while revealing the true nature of the assault on her family. Someone had provided territorial officials with information designed to cast doubt on her motivations, though what that information might be remained unclear. Commissioner Hayes, I provided all required documentation regarding my financial resources and my ability to care for these children. If you have specific concerns about their welfare, I'm prepared to address them. If you're here to pursue some other agenda, then I suggest you be honest about your real objectives. The directness of her challenge clearly surprised Hayes, who had obviously expected the kind of defensive behavior that would make his task easier. When he spoke again, his voice carried undertones of warning that suggested the investigation was merely the opening move in a more complex campaign designed to achieve objectives that had nothing to do with child welfare. Mrs. Worthington, cooperation would be in everyone's best interests. The territorial government has broad authority over child placement decisions, and that authority will be exercised as necessary to ensure appropriate outcomes for all parties involved. Catherine stood with a kind of quiet dignity that suggested she was prepared for whatever consequences her defiance might bring, though she understood that the battle for her family's security was only beginning. Commissioner Hayes, if you intend to challenge my custody of these children, then I suggest you prepare for legal proceedings that will examine not only my qualifications, but also the motivations of whoever initiated this investigation. Some secrets are more dangerous when exposed than when they remain hidden. The territorial officials left with expressions that suggested they had not anticipated such determined resistance from a woman they had obviously underestimated. But their departure brought no relief from the growing pressure that threatened to destroy everything Catherine had built during her first month as guardian to 7 orphan children. Someone with substantial power and resources wanted her family destroyed, and they were prepared to use territorial authority to achieve objectives that went far beyond simple concerns about child welfare. That evening, as Catherine sat alone in her study preparing for battles she had hoped never to fight again, she reflected on the choices that had brought her to this isolated frontier community and the secrets she had thought safely buried beneath 8 years of careful anonymity. The children sleeping upstairs had become more precious to her than she had expected when she first appeared in Judge Caldwell's courtroom. But protecting them might require revealing truths about her past that could prove more dangerous than the current threats to their security. The woman who had once been someone else entirely prepared to become Catherine Worthington completely, understanding that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost, that some things mattered more than safety or anonymity, and that the children who trusted her deserved protection that extended beyond simple financial security to include the kind of fierce maternal love that would defend them against any force that threatened their welfare. The winter storm that descended on Washer 3 days before Christmas arrived with a kind of sudden ferocity that transformed familiar landscapes into treacherous wilderness. But it also provided Catherine Worthington with a perfect cover for actions she had been planning since Commissioner Hayes's threatening visit. While territorial officials waited in town for weather conditions to improve before pursuing their campaign against her family, Catherine prepared to reveal secrets she had guarded for 8 years and to deploy resources that would demonstrate exactly why some battles should never be started against the wrong opponents. She had spent the previous week sending carefully coded telegrams to contacts in Denver, Chicago, and Washington whose names would have surprised anyone who assumed Catherine Worthington was merely a wealthy widow with charitable impulses. The responses had arrived through channels that bypassed Washer's Territorial Telegraph Office, confirming that certain powerful individuals remained willing to assist someone whose previous services to territorial development had earned lasting gratitude and continuing influence among people who shaped policy at the highest levels of government. The children remained safely housed with Mrs. Sanford's sister in town, unaware that their guardian was preparing for confrontations that would either secure their permanent safety or destroy everything she had built during her months as their adoptive mother. Catherine had explained their temporary relocation as a precaution against the severe weather, but she knew that the real storms threatening their security had little to do with seasonal conditions and everything to do with forces that viewed 7 orphan children as valuable commodities rather than human beings deserving protection and love. On the morning when the blizzard finally exhausted itself, leaving Washer buried under 3 feet of snow that would take days to clear, Catherine received the visitors she had been expecting, though they arrived in numbers and with authority that exceeded even her careful preparations. Commissioner Hayes returned with a full territorial marshal's escort, accompanied by legal documents that claimed emergency authority to remove the children from her custody, pending a comprehensive investigation of her background and motivations. But he also brought someone whose presence changed the entire nature of the confrontation, someone whose appearance in Washer meant that Catherine's carefully guarded secrets were about to be revealed in ways that would reshape everyone's understanding of who she really was, and why 7 orphaned children had become the center of a territorial political battle that reached far beyond one woman's charitable impulses. Mrs. Worthington, Commissioner Hayes announced with a triumphant tone of someone who believed he held decisive advantages. I'd like you to meet Territorial Governor Richard Graves, who has come personally to ensure that this matter receives appropriate attention from the highest levels of territorial authority. Catherine studied the man who stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having his authority acknowledged without question, noting the expensive quality of his clothing, the calculating intelligence in his eyes, and the particular kind of smile that suggested he viewed this confrontation as a personally satisfying conclusion to a campaign that had required considerable planning and political maneuvering. Governor Graves, she replied with the kind of calm courtesy that concealed rapid mental calculations about the forces now arrayed against her family and the resources she would need to deploy in response. I'm surprised that child custody matters warrant your personal attention, particularly during such challenging weather conditions. Graves' smile widened with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he held information that would prove decisive in the coming confrontation. Mrs. Worthington, or should I say, Mrs. Catherine Beaumont Ashford, formerly of the Ashford Mining and Railroad Consortium, recently deceased according to territorial records, but apparently quite alive and engaged in activities that raise interesting questions about identity fraud and illegal financial transactions. The name fell into the snow-muffled silence like a thunderclap, revealing secrets that Catherine had thought safely buried beneath 8 years of careful anonymity and the construction of an entirely new identity in frontier obscurity. Governor Graves had somehow discovered not only her real name, but also her connection to one of the most powerful financial enterprises in territorial development, information that transformed her from mysterious charitable widow into someone whose background carried implications that reached far beyond Washer's isolated community. Catherine Beaumont Ashford had been the wife of mining magnate Jonathan Ashford, whose consortium had controlled significant portions of Colorado Territory's mineral development until his sudden death in what had been reported as a mining accident, but which those close to the family suspected might have been something considerably more sinister. Her disappearance following her husband's funeral had generated extensive speculation about her whereabouts and her intentions regarding the vast financial empire she had inherited through marriage and expanded through her own considerable business acumen. Governor Graves, Catherine replied with composure that revealed nothing about her internal response to having her carefully constructed new identity taken away. I'm not sure what relevance my previous circumstances might have to my current responsibilities as guardian to 7 children who need family and security rather than political manipulation. But Graves had not finished revealing the extent of his knowledge about her background and the implications of her current situation. Mrs. Ashford, your previous circumstances have considerable relevance when they include responsibility for mining claims, railroad development rights, and territorial land grants that were transferred to various trusts following your husband's death. Claims and rights that might prove quite valuable to anyone who could establish legal authority over the heirs to families who possessed relevant information or documentation. The revelation hit Catherine with the force of recognition, finally explaining why anyone would go to such lengths to acquire 7 orphan children whose only obvious value lay in their need for care and protection. The children's parents had not been random victims of frontier hardships. They had been targeted because of their connections to properties and information that Catherine's enemies wanted to acquire through whatever means proved necessary. Tommy Nelson's parents had owned land adjacent to mining claims controlled by the Ashford Consortium. The Chun twins' parents had worked mines whose geological data might reveal valuable mineral deposits. Sarah and Rebecca Maples's father had been surveying properties that included potential railroad routes. Even little Danny Cruz's family had been carrying documents related to territorial land grants that could prove extremely valuable to anyone seeking to expand control over Colorado's developing resources. Governor Graves, if you're suggesting that I adopted these children to gain access to their inheritance rights or family information, then you're demonstrating a profound misunderstanding of my motivations and capabilities. I have no need for additional financial resources, and I certainly don't require the assistance of orphan children to pursue business interests. Graves' expression shifted to reveal glimpses of the harder man beneath his veneer of political courtesy, someone who had obviously invested considerable effort in orchestrating this confrontation, and who expected it to conclude with his complete victory over an opponent he had underestimated until this moment. Mrs. Ashford, your needs are irrelevant to this discussion. What matters is that these children represent access to properties and information that various parties consider essential to territorial development. Arrangements have been made to ensure they receive appropriate care with families whose loyalty to territorial progress can be trusted without question. The casual reference to arrangements that would separate her children and place them with families chosen for their willingness to surrender valuable inheritance rights revealed the full scope of the conspiracy Catherine now faced. Governor Graves and his allies had identified 7 orphan children as obstacles to territorial resource development and had planned their removal with a kind of calculated efficiency that treated human beings as inconvenient complications to be resolved through political manipulation. Governor Graves, these children are under my legal protection, and any attempt to remove them from my custody will be challenged through every available legal and political channel. I suggest you reconsider this course of action before it brings consequences you may not have anticipated. The warning was delivered with quiet authority that surprised everyone present, including Commissioner Hayes, who had obviously expected the revelation of Catherine's true identity to produce defensive confusion rather than determined resistance. But Governor Graves had not achieved his position through timidity, and he responded to her defiance with a kind of escalating pressure that had proven effective in previous political conflicts. Mrs. Ashford, I think you may not fully understand your current situation. The territorial government has broad authority over child welfare decisions, and that authority will be exercised regardless of your personal preferences or your previous financial influence. These children will be removed from your custody today, and they will be placed with families whose qualifications extend beyond simple financial resources to include demonstrated loyalty to territorial development objectives. Catherine stood with a kind of quiet dignity that had once commanded boardrooms and political meetings, understanding that the moment had arrived when secrets could no longer be protected and battles could no longer be avoided. Governor Graves, before you proceed with actions that might prove difficult to reverse, perhaps you should consider why someone with my background and resources chose to disappear from public life 8 years ago, and what kinds of protection that disappearance might have been designed to provide. The suggestion that her exile had been strategic rather than merely convenient clearly surprised Graves, who had obviously assumed that Catherine's retreat to frontier anonymity represented defeat rather than tactical preparation for conflicts he was only beginning to understand. When she spoke again, her voice carried undertones of authority that had been absent during her months of careful invisibility in Washer. Governor, the Ashford Consortium included partnerships with federal officials whose interest in territorial development extends far beyond local political considerations. When my husband died under circumstances that raised questions about territorial safety and federal oversight, arrangements were made to ensure that certain information remained secure until territorial conditions improved sufficiently to warrant renewed federal attention. The implication that her husband's death might have involved territorial political corruption sent visible alarm through Governor Graves' confident demeanor, though he maintained his aggressive stance, while rapidly calculating the potential consequences of confronting someone whose federal connections might prove more dangerous than he had anticipated. Mrs. Ashford, I'm not impressed by vague threats about federal intervention. The territorial government has legitimate authority over child welfare matters, and that authority will not be intimidated by references to undefined federal interests. Catherine smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, an expression that carried no warmth but considerable promise of difficulties ahead for anyone who chose to continue opposing her. Governor Graves, I appreciate your confidence in territorial authority, but perhaps you should consider why federal officials might be interested in ensuring the safety of children whose parents died under circumstances that suggest territorial resources are being acquired through methods that warrant federal investigation. She paused, allowing the implications of her words to settle over the assembled officials while reaching into her coat to withdraw documents that would transform the entire nature of their confrontation. These are copies of correspondence between my late husband and federal mining inspectors regarding irregularities in territorial resource allocation, along with geological surveys that suggest certain territorial officials have been profiting from information that should have remained confidential until proper federal oversight could be established. The documents rustled in the cold air as she held them up, and Governor Graves' expression shifted from confident authority to something approaching panic as he recognized the potential consequences of federal scrutiny into territorial resource management. The papers she held represented evidence that could destroy careers, trigger federal investigations, and potentially result in criminal charges against territorial officials who had used their positions to enrich themselves at the expense of territorial development and federal law. Furthermore, Catherine continued with the calm authority of someone who understood exactly how much power she wielded in this confrontation. Federal officials have been informed that 7 children whose parents possessed relevant information about territorial resource irregularities are currently under my protection. Any attempt to remove these children from my custody will be interpreted as witness intimidation and will result in immediate federal intervention in territorial affairs. The revelation that she had federal protection for her adopted family sent shock through the assembled territorial officials, who had obviously assumed they could proceed with their plans without facing consequences that extended beyond local political resistance. Governor Graves found himself confronting an opponent whose resources and connections far exceeded anything he had prepared to handle. Mrs. Ashford, you're suggesting that federal officials would intervene in territorial child welfare matters based on unsubstantiated accusations about resource management irregularities. That seems unlikely given federal respect for territorial authority in local matters. Catherine's smile widened with the satisfied expression of someone who held decisive advantages in a confrontation her opponents had initiated without understanding the forces they were challenging. Governor Graves, federal respect for territorial authority depends on territorial compliance with federal law. When territorial officials attempt to acquire valuable resources through intimidation, fraud, and manipulation of child welfare systems, that respect disappears quite rapidly. She reached into her coat again and withdrew a telegram bearing official federal seals that made Commissioner Hayes step backward involuntarily, while Governor Graves' face went pale with recognition of the forces now arrayed against his carefully planned campaign. This is a federal warrant for the investigation of territorial resource allocation irregularities, along with federal protection orders for all individuals whose safety might be threatened by territorial officials seeking to suppress evidence of regulatory violations. The children under my care are specifically named as protected witnesses whose testimony might prove essential to federal prosecution of territorial corruption. The telegram's implications were devastating for everyone involved in the conspiracy against Catherine's family, transforming what had seemed like a simple child custody matter into a federal investigation that could destroy careers and result in criminal prosecutions. Governor Graves found himself facing not a vulnerable widow whose children could be easily acquired, but a woman whose federal connections and documented evidence of territorial corruption made her virtually untouchable through normal political channels. Mrs. Ashford, surely we can reach some accommodation that serves everyone's interests without involving federal authorities in matters that might be resolved through territorial cooperation and mutual understanding. The suggestion that negotiation might still be possible revealed how completely Governor Graves' position had collapsed once Catherine's true identity and resources became clear. He was no longer trying to acquire valuable children. He was trying to avoid federal prosecution for corruption that extended far beyond his current attempt to manipulate child welfare proceedings. Governor Graves, the only accommodation I'm prepared to consider is your immediate departure from my property, along with assurances that no further attempts will be made to interfere with my family's security. The children under my care will remain under my care, and any future interference in their welfare will be met with federal prosecution for witness intimidation and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The territorial officials retreated with considerably less confidence than they had displayed upon arrival, understanding that their carefully planned campaign had collapsed completely once they encountered an opponent whose preparation and resources exceeded anything they had anticipated. Governor Graves' final glance toward Catherine carried the recognition that he had challenged the wrong person at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. After they left, Catherine stood at her front window watching their carriages disappear through the snow, while reflecting on the costs of revealing secrets she had guarded for 8 years and the relief of finally being able to protect her family without hiding behind constructed anonymity. The woman who had been Catherine Worthington would always exist, but Catherine Beaumont Ashford had returned to ensure that 7 orphaned children received protection that extended far beyond simple financial security. That evening, when the children returned from their temporary sanctuary in town, they found their guardian different somehow, more confident, more openly affectionate, more clearly committed to their permanent security. She gathered them around the kitchen table, where they had shared breakfast for months, and began the careful process of explaining that their family was now completely safe from anyone who might want to separate them. "Children," she said with the kind of gentle authority that had always characterized her relationship with them, "there are people who wanted to take you away from our family because they thought you might be valuable for reasons that had nothing to do with who you are as individuals. Those people have learned that our family has protection they cannot overcome, and they will not bother us again." Tommy Nelson, now 7 and increasingly confident in his role as protective older brother to the younger children, raised his hand with the careful politeness she had taught him. "Mama Catherine, does this mean we can stay together forever? All of us, no matter what?" "Yes, Tommy. All of you, together, for as long as you want to be part of this family. No one can take you away from me, and no one can separate you from each other. You belong here, you belong to me, and I belong to you." The Chen twins exchanged glances that communicated their shared relief in the mixture of languages that had become natural to household conversations where multiple cultures were honored rather than suppressed. Sarah and Rebecca Maples moved closer together with a kind of satisfied smiles that suggested their carefully maintained defenses were finally beginning to relax. Little Danny Cruz climbed into Catherine's lap with the confident trust of someone who no longer feared that bedtime might bring morning abandonment. Spring arrived early that year, bringing news that Governor Graves had been quietly removed from Territorial office pending federal investigation into resource allocation irregularities, that Commissioner Hayes had been reassigned to positions with considerably less authority, and that the Territorial government had issued official commendations for Catherine's contributions to child welfare and territorial development. The federal investigation proceeded with a kind of thorough attention that ensured territorial officials would be far more careful about respecting federal oversight and territorial law. But more importantly for the Ashford family, spring brought the kind of settled routine that allowed 7 children to grow into themselves without fearing that external forces might disrupt their security or separate them from the woman who had chosen them completely and permanently. Catherine's decision to reveal her true identity had protected them from immediate threats, but it had also freed her to provide them with educational opportunities and future possibilities that extended far beyond what most frontier children could imagine. The Maples property, where they had built their family, expanded during the summer to include a proper school building where Catherine could provide advanced education not only for her own children, but also for other washer families who wanted their children to receive instruction that prepared them for lives beyond territorial limitations. Her federal connections proved valuable for securing qualified teachers, educational materials, and the kind of official recognition that transformed their household school into a territorial educational institution that attracted students from throughout the region. Tommy Nelson discovered talents for mathematics and engineering that suggested he might follow paths similar to those his parents had planned before their deaths. The Chen twins developed skills in languages and cultural translation that made them valuable intermediaries between Washer's growing Chinese community and the broader Territorial population. Sarah and Rebecca Maples showed artistic abilities that Catherine encouraged through private instruction and access to materials that allowed them to develop talents their original circumstances would never have supported. Little Danny Cruz grew into a confident, curious child whose early trauma left no lasting scars thanks to the kind of patient, consistent love that had healed wounds that might otherwise have shaped his entire life. By his 5th birthday, he had become the acknowledged family comedian, whose laughter filled their house with the kind of joy that proved some investments produced returns that could never be calculated in financial terms. The community of Washer gradually adjusted to having Catherine Beaumont Ashford as a permanent resident, though her true identity added layers of respect and occasional nervousness to social interactions that had once been characterized by simple curiosity about her background. She was no longer a mysterious charitable widow, but a woman whose federal connections and business expertise made her one of the most influential residents in Territorial history. But Catherine herself seemed less interested in political influence than in the daily work of raising 7 children who had become more precious to her than any business enterprise or federal appointment could ever be. She had discovered that wealth meant little compared to the trust of children who called her Mama Catherine, without reservation. That influence paled beside the satisfaction of watching young minds develop under patient guidance, and that success could be measured most accurately by the laughter that filled their house each evening when homework was finished and family time began. On a warm summer evening 2 years after the confrontation that had secured their permanent safety, Catherine sat on her front porch watching her children play in the yard while reflecting on the choices that had brought her to this isolated frontier community and the secrets that had nearly cost her everything she had learned to value most. The woman who had once controlled mining consortiums and influenced territorial policy had found her most important work in teaching 7 orphan children that love was not something that could be purchased, that families were built through daily choice rather than legal obligation, and that some commitments transcended any calculation of cost or benefit. Governor Graves and his allies had assumed that children could be treated as commodities to be acquired by whoever offered the highest price or possessed the greatest political influence. They had failed to understand that Catherine's adoption had never been a business transaction, but a recognition that some things, trust, belonging, the laughter of children who felt completely secure in their family's love, represented wealth that no amount of money could purchase and no political authority could destroy. The evening light painted the mountains that protected their valley in shades of gold and promise, while 7 children whose lives had been transformed by a woman's decision to prove that love had no price played with the confident security of those who knew they belonged somewhere completely, knowing someone had chosen them not for what they might provide, but simply because they needed family, and because the greatest wealth anyone could possess was the opportunity to love without reservation or condition. In the end, that was legacy enough for any life. 7 children who would grow into adults knowing that they mattered, that they were wanted, that they belonged to someone who would defend their welfare against any force that threatened their security. Catherine Beaumont Ashford had possessed money and political influence, but Catherine Worthington had discovered something far more valuable: the knowledge that some purchases could only be made with love, that some prices could only be paid through daily commitment to another person's welfare, and that the most important work anyone could do was to prove to a child that they deserved love without condition or limitation. The schoolhouse bell would ring each morning, calling children to lessons that might change their lives in ways that no business enterprise or political appointment ever could. Washer would continue to exist as a place where families were built through choice rather than circumstance, where communities could resist corruption through solidarity and federal protection, where someone could discover that the most meaningful influence was exercised not through boardrooms or political offices, but through the patient work of raising children who trusted completely in their family's love. And 7 children who had once been orphans would grow into adults who understood that wealth could not be measured in dollars, that security came from belonging rather than possessing, and that the greatest gift anyone could receive was the knowledge that someone had chosen them completely, permanently, and without reservation, not because they were valuable, but because they were loved.